Well, apparently San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Brandon Aiyuk wants out, and therefore the New Orleans Saints should want in. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to take a look at the things that can get in the way of offensive success for Klint Kubaik's next system or new system here in New Orleans, and how the Saints can potentially get ahead of those things. But we're also going to lay out why this system should work in New Orleans as our midweek fundamentals before we get to that big news on Tuesday when it came down to the NFL. San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Brandon Aiyuk has failed, it looks like, to achieve a long-term extension with the San Francisco 49ers and therefore has asked for a trade and wants out. I'll explain why the New Orleans Saints should and should not want to get in. We'll kind of take a look at both sides of that equation. We appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, your first listen of the day, every day, and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at FanDuel, where you can make every moment more right now. FanDuel is giving bonuses and boosts to every single customer. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long over at FanDuel.com, which is where you could go to get started. So the New Orleans Saints have a new opportunity here to potentially shake things up this offseason. I want to go into the case for and against the New Orleans Saints pursuing Brandon Aiyuk. My personal opinion is that they should at least make the phone call. It doesn't mean you have to give the farm for him. Doesn't mean you have to really get into competing with teams like the Steelers and the Washington Commanders and others who are very likely to be also a part of this conversation or are very likely to be a part of this conversation. But I do think you owe it to yourself, your organization, your fan base, your roster, your coaches to at least give this one a shot. See what happens with it, right? Go at least give John Lynch a phone call. Hey, what would it take? What's the asking price? Kind of figure all this stuff out. There were some early reports that, of course, a first round pick was the asking price. That's what every team wants for almost any player these days. That's very rarely what they ever get. A lot of people assume that the typical quote unquote disgruntled player pay price, which is a second round and a fifth round pick. We've seen it for several players now across the NFL. I believe that was even what Brian Burns ended up getting traded for, despite the fact that Carolina had an offer on the table a year before from the Los Angeles Rams of 2 first-round picks. But let's not get focused on the Panthers' failures here. Let's look at a potential success for the New Orleans Saints. So you imagine that a second and a fifth-round pick could potentially be enough. Is that good enough for a one-year rental? Is that good enough for a guy that you want to bring into the building for a year, then maybe get an extension done with? We'll see. I think that there is a misconception that Brandon Aiyuk wanted his extension from the San Francisco 49ers, didn't get it, and therefore where he ends up, that he would require getting an extension and a long-term deal done wherever he ends up as well. That's not always the case. We'll learn if that's a part of Brandon Aiyuk's part of the equation, but that still wouldn't stop teams probably from pursuing him as a one-year rental anyway, and that's probably what this would be. If you're the New Orleans Saints, you trade for him, bring him in, give up a second and a fifth round pick, you get a year with him, give him the opportunity then to go hit free agency in 2025, same time as T. Higgins is now set to hit free agency. Let him go out there, sign a big contract. You get a third round compensatory selection in the next year as a part of that equation. And then boom. Yeah, there you go. You're done. You know what I mean? You got what you got out of him for a year. Is that really the route that the Saints want to go? I don't know, but that's the case for doing it, is that you would bring him in for 2024 and try to maximize your ability to compete in 2024. Now, I have been gung-ho on the idea that Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed are set for star trajectories in 2024. I do think that bringing in a Brandon Aiyuk impacts that because it takes away targets from those guys to some capacity, at least. And with the like we said, we're expecting to see more 2 wide receiver sets, things like that. That could potentially cut into one of those guys' snaps, particularly probably Rashid Shaheed in that equation. But outside of that, it also gives you a guy to draw the sort of attention of a defense and then be able to elevate the talent that you have on the opposite side of Aiyuk, whether that's Olave or Shaheed in most of those situations. So for me, the thing that I look at is you kind of have to balance the 4, which is, can he help you compete right now, versus the against, does he stifle, even if just for a year, the development of your future superstar potential, future star potential level players? Which one's better? And I think for the long term, you're probably leaning towards the latter as more of your focus. But for the short term, you're leaning towards more of the former, actually trying to make this move as the better option, which makes sense because one of them is very clearly short term while the other one is very clearly long term. Now, you could potentially land Brandon Aiyuk and work out an extension, because an extension would allow you to knock down his cap hit in 2024, extend and push some money out into 2025, 2026, 2027, all those other things. An extension probably would be part of what would be required in order for the team to be able to make the move in the first place. But that depends. Like, this team has shown that it is not right now seeing itself in position to give out those long-term deals, apropos this offseason, where everything was a bunch of short-term deals, 1-year deals, things like that. So I think that there's your case against, right? Stifle some of the development of some of your younger players while also opening up more opportunities for them, but overall probably stifling them because it's taking targets away, taking focus away from those players. And then, of course, having to deal with the money of it all. The Saints could potentially give up that 2nd and 5th round picks, those 2nd and 5th round picks, and then end up bringing him in under the salary cap by, finally getting this extension done with Alvin Kamara to knock the salary cap space down and things like that. Like, there's a lot of different ways they could potentially get him in under the hood. But then what do you do with him after that? What do you do with the money after that? Do you just let it sit as a whole right away? Or do you end up trying to extend and then potentially pushing more money down the road when you're trying to get out from under some of the cap mechanics that you've had to do post-COVID, post the COVID seasons and all that? So that's where things can get a little bit kind of jumbly, a little bit jam-packed for you and everything like that. But if you're looking at some point to rotate this team into what has become the typical style of building an offense across the NFL, which is build the offense, maintain, find, sign, trade for, obtain, however it is you want to look at it, long-term talent on the offense around the quarterback, and then eventually just slot a rookie quarterback in or a quarterback on a rookie contract in, then this then could potentially be one of those 2-3 year down the line moves. But then you're having entirely different conversations, because have you extended Chris Olave? Have you extended Rashid Shaheed? Who's your offensive coordinator? Who's your head coach in 2-3 years? All these other things. So it just seems like a little bit of uncertainty when it comes to that. So I think everything you're looking for the 4 when it comes to this, the case for trading for Aiyuk, is about short-term competition. Everything, though, in terms of the kind of argument against a trade for Brandon Aiyuk comes down to, well, what about the long-term ability to be competitive for this team? I think that's the way that you're looking at it. Are you willing to put the long-term development on hold to see if you can compete right now? Or are you concerned that the roster, even with Brandon Aiyuk, isn't good enough to compete right now, and therefore the long-term goals are much more important? That's kind of, I think, what this is all going to come down to. Plus, of course, teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, Washington Commanders, and others being very, very desperate in terms of trying to find a receiver for their young quarterbacks, or new quarterbacks, let's say it that way. All right, coming up next, let's take a look at midweek fundamentals. I want to take a look at what Klint Kubaik's system is, how it complements the offense and the players on it. Then we'll get a look at what could potentially stand in the way of success and how the Saints can avoid those pitfalls. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends at FanDuel. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and our official sports betting partner here on the Locked On Podcast Network, is doing something super fun all summer long. They're hooking up all customers with boost or bonuses daily, something for everyone, every day, all summer long over at FanDuel. And they've got some fun odds as well, including some specials for the New Orleans Saints. Think Chris Olave is going to catch more than 10 receiving touchdowns this season? That's plus 340. Turn $100 into $340. Think Alvin Kamara will rush 4, 5 or more touchdowns and have 5 or more receiving touchdowns this season? That's plus 650. Turn $100 into $650. Lots of stuff just like that, including week 1 odds, end of year award odds, and a bunch more over at FanDuel.com. That's where that's where you're gonna want to go to get started to make the most out of your summer. Once again, that is FanDuel.com. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, family. A lot of Saints fans are excited about the Klint Kubaik offense and that Shanahan influence finally arriving here in the city of New Orleans. So let's break down what it means for the New Orleans Saints offense, what that offense actually brings, and how/if it does actually complement the players on this New Orleans Saints roster, what they need to do for success under Klint Kubaik. That's what we're here to break down as part of our midweek fundamentals, which we do every single either Wednesday or Thursday. Just a little bit of general, maybe a little bit more like teach tape type football talk to really kind of go into concepts, explain some things like that. So that's what we're going to highlight today as we go into the Shanahan quote unquote offense. And we'll explain kind of what to expect, what to look for, all those other things. We appreciate you very much. As always, make it Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 stream program specifically for you. Bring you all the biggest stories from around the National Football League, including now this big Brandon Aiyuk story. Locked On 49ers will be featured on there. Peacock and Williamson's going to be featured on there, as well as Locked On NFL. And I'm sure other shows that are going to be looking for potentially trading for Brandon Aiyuk will all be there as well. So make sure you go and check that out. You can find it on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app and on Locked On Sports Today's YouTube page as well, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So when it comes down to Klint Kubaik's offense, 3 of the core principles that you're going to see, or not core principles, but 3 of the big elements that you're going to see in this New Orleans Saints offense are ones that we've talked about all offseason long, right? Motion is number 1, or not number 1. Motion's one of them. Play action is another big part of it. And then the next thing that I would say is kind of disguise. And when I talk about disguise, what I mean is what your offense looks like pre-snap and everything. And so the Saints are trying to kind of run as many different plays out of the same looks. Think about Los Angeles Rams last year. Maybe you take the field in one formation and then motion right back into the formation that teams are used to seeing you in, and then not understanding exactly what it is that you plan to deploy from that, especially with the motion now integrated, how play action does or doesn't do it. But the other thing that I think is one of those ones I probably should have said 4, that is kind of cornerstones to this offense is the wide zone or outside zone run game. So I want to highlight all 4 of those things and then kind of step into how does this actually complement this New Orleans Saints team. Let's start with the run game because it's probably the one that's most lengthy to explain. The run game is typically predicated on, when it comes to the outside zone run game, a moving offensive line that's worried more about blocking areas of the field than they are actually worried about blocking the person that's lined up directly in front of them. That is the difference between zone and man run, right? That's the difference between those zone and man blocking schemes. Zone, you're moving into an area of the field and you're trying to block that area of the field, keep that part of the field clean. And then man, you're just trying to block the guy that's directly in front of you. Gap scheme is the other thing you'll hear that called as well, GAP. So there's that part. The other part is the outside zone part of this is that you're running towards the outside areas of the tackle as opposed to running in between the tackles. So what you'll typically see is an offense that has even number gaps on one side, odd number gaps on the other side. And so there'll be an 8 gap and a 9 gap, which are equidistant from center on the opposite sides of each other outside of the tackle. And typically you're attacking that area. And some teams will have a 19 for, an under the center single back snap and handoff. They'll have, a different code for when it's out of the shotgun. They'll have a different code for when it's a 2 back or whatever it might be. They'll have a bunch of different ways to kind of do that. But typically 8 and 9 are kind of what those gaps are on the outside. So if you hear anything like a 9 run or an 8 run or a run to the 8, run to the 9, that's what they're talking about. That's the outside areas of the offense running outside of the tackles. So that's what a lot of this run game is going to be predicated on, getting players out in space. So now let's answer one of the questions that we set out to answer. How does this complement the New Orleans Saints personnel? It complements Alvin Kamara very, very well. It's what he's always done well, particularly back 2017, really 2018 when they really started to lean into it a little bit more. 19 and 20 had a good bit of it. 2020, 2021 is when you really kind of started to see things kind of tick back a lot more, running up the middle. Alvin Kamara having to play the bell cow back role and all those other things. Sean Payton even talked about it back in, I believe it was 2021. You can kind of feel like that rushing production come down when he wasn't getting out in space anymore. And so you hear us as analysts all the time talk about, Alvin Kamara is a better back when you get him out in space. And that's something that the New Orleans Saints absolutely need to do, yada, yada. That's what we're talking about. Get him outside of running where the core congestion of a defense is, and then get him instead of running to the perimeters where there's, lighter tacklers and safeties and defensive backs and all these other things that are going to be the majority of the players that are out there. Obviously, you're going to get linebackers and defensive linemen that are going to get out there. All that, of course, that's going to happen. But so, yes, I would say that the zone run element and the outside zone run element of this Shanahan offense, Kubiak offense, or with the Kubiak influence, is going to be predicated on exactly that. And that does, in fact, complement what Alvin Kamara does. It's interesting when it comes to Kendre Miller. Kendre Miller did not do a lot of outside zone run while he was in college, but did do a lot of inside zone run. So the principles are there. He just has to kind of learn the new gaps. And I don't think he's going to have any trouble doing that. He's an incredibly smart player. That should be there. And then Jamal Williams has appreciated the system from afar. He even recounted, watching Jerick McKinnon and the San Francisco 49ers in a playoff game run like crazy. I think McKinnon went for over 220 something yards in that game, if I remember correctly. And so he's admired this system for a long time, has always wanted to be in it. Here's an opportunity there. This is also a system that's going to want to throw to its running backs out of the backfield. That complements each of these players as well, all of which have proven to be at different times solid pass catchers. Let's go to motion and play action. We've beaten this dead horse quite a bit over the course of the offseason, but motion will help you identify what's going on with the defense. That plays into Derek Carr's strength. So yes, this does complement Derek Carr. He is a good pre-snap diagnosing quarterback. That gives him an opportunity to be able to have another method by which to diagnose what a defense is doing. If a wide receiver runs from one side of the field to the other and a defensive back follows, it's man coverage. If they don't, it's typically zone coverage. Gives you an idea of what it is that a defense is doing. Man coverage would be the defensive backs are specifically keened in on trying to stop the receiver that they're assigned to. Zone coverage meaning that those defensive backs and defensive players are instead covering different areas of the field. Diagnosing that also plays into the strength of a guy like Chris Olave, as well as Rashid Shaheed, who both do a very good job playing off of press, playing off of man. They've run those routes very well, but they also do a really good job finding soft spots in zone. So if you can uncover that it's zone coverage ahead of time, gives them an opportunity to maybe be able to learn a little bit more about what the defense is showing them and how they rotate post snap so that they can kind of figure out maybe preemptively where some of those holes might be. If it's a too high situation pre-snap, the players might believe, okay, well, if it stays that way, then there's going to be holes, in kind of the shallow areas, potentially maybe over the outside, to just, in the cover two hole is what they call it. But then if they rotate to the center of the field, then it gives you an idea that okay, so it might be 3 high. And if it's zone coverage, then there might be some spots here in the middle of the field in the intermediate area and things like that. So it just allows you to kind of diagnose a little bit more and have a little bit more of that kind of understanding. And then play action is obviously something that plays into the strength of any offense in the NFL, especially one where the run game is working, and in particular where a run game is dynamic. When I talk about a run game being dynamic, I mean one that attacks not only up the middle, but also on the outside, because it varies up all the different things that you can do with play action. It allows you to add rollouts when you have an outside zone run. It allows you to be able to just do some standard play action dropbacks and passes if you're running up the middle. It allows you to do some other creative things like waggles, which is when you fake to more than one player. If you're having that motion around the quarterback with the wide receivers and all these other things. So it allows you to do a bunch of pretty interesting and innovative, creative, challenging things to an opposing defense. So those are like the bare minimum things that I would say to pay attention to when it comes to what a Kubiak offense is bringing in replication of a Kyle Shanahan offense, which is also the Mike Shanahan offense, which was also created with Gary Kubiak, who's Klint Kubiak's dad. You know the connections here. These are all of the things that will make you look at it and go, okay, so here's why a Klint Kubiak system works. Next thing I want to look at is what can stand in the way of success, because that's going to allow us to dig a little bit deeper into one particular thing that we haven't gotten very deep into, which is play calling. That's going to be the big thing. You can have the game plan all you want, But if you can't call the plays in the most optimal ways, not trying to get bars there, but bars there, it could limit your success big time. So how do the New Orleans Saints skirt that? That's what we're going to talk about next as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for a small business, you want to make sure that you're hiring quality professionals so you make sure you get the right person for that role. That's why you've got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools that you need to be able to hire the right professionals for your team without much concern. LinkedIn Jobs is awesome. It's not just a job board. It's the destination for professionals who are looking for jobs. Over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even take a look at those other leading job sites. So if you're not looking at LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. So if you've got a small business and you're looking to hire, LinkedIn is the place that you should go. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get qualified candidates within 24 hours of posting their job. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. You can post your job for free today at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints are set to have an improved offensive system, but what about their improved offensive play calling? That we don't know about just yet and won't be able to find out until the regular season. I'm here to tell you some of my concerns, but more importantly, how the New Orleans Saints can curb those concerns well ahead of time. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here. Don't forget, we are your team every day. Coming up tomorrow, we are going to be chatting with the Chief Analytics Officer over at FTN, as well as the creator of DVOA, one of my favorite metrics in all of professional sports, Aaron Schatz. We're going to be taking a look at who Derek Carr was in 2023 and how the New Orleans Saints and he can improve going into 2024. We'll take a look at the defense, what hurt the run game, what could potentially help the run game over on the defensive side. And of course, we'll look at the offensive side of the run game as well, and much, much more. We're going to try to do as big a diagnostic with Aaron as possible in tomorrow's episode. So make sure you come through for some of that. It's one of those real, like, make for a smarter football fan type conversation. So I'm really, really excited to share that with all of you. Coming up here, though, what I want to focus on is kind of trying to look at both sides of the story, just like we did with the Brandon Aiyuk thing. I wanted to give a little bit of like, hey, here's some of the right reasons. Here's some of the reasons for. Here's some of the reasons against. We broke down some of the reasons why a Klint Kubaik offense is expected to work in New Orleans. I think it's fair to say. And then if those expectations come, under expectation, then obviously there's a larger conversation to be had at that time. But what are some of the things that potentially cause that? And I think one of the biggest and most glaring things that we just don't simply know about yet is play calling. This was a big issue for the New Orleans Saints as well. If we really think about it, the Saints system over the course of the past couple of years was effectively still shadows of, but still a Sean Payton system. And we've seen a Sean Payton system work before here in New Orleans. One of the issues, aside from offensive line play and all these other things, particularly on third and fourth downs, offensive line play on first and second downs in the passing game was actually pretty good, one of the best in the NFL. According to DVOA, we'll dive into that a little bit tomorrow, but they were 21st in DVOA when it came to third and fourth downs, according to the almanac there. So we'll dive into some more of those numbers tomorrow. But I think outside of that, I think we can all agree that one of the other things that was a big issue was play calling, right? New Orleans Saints 2nd and 10. Everybody kind of knew what that was going to be. Lack of screen passes, lack of route deployments out of the backfield, taking players off the field when they absolutely needed to be on the field in key situations, things like that. A lot of routes being run into the same areas of the field, all that kind of stuff. So, and that might not necessarily be play calling. I should put that on play calling, but you get the idea. Like, play calling was one of the issues for the New Orleans Saints offense. So how do you know it's going to be better in 2024? Well, we simply don't. Klint Kubaik proved to be a fine play caller during his 2021 season with the Minnesota Vikings. I think a lot of folks in Minnesota will tell you, though, that Kirk Cousins had a lot to do with the success by making some of those decisions at the line of scrimmage. Now, I believe that if an offense is in the hands of a quarterback that is the right quarterback to run that system, that having that quarterback being given the freedom to make changes to the line of scrimmage is not a bad thing, right? I think we saw that in New Orleans many, many times with Drew Brees. I believe there was even the stuff about like Drew Brees would call he was the one that orchestrated the 2-minute drills and things like that. And so like those types of conversations, if true, were the ones that kind of give you an idea that, hey, no matter what, like this is a team effort. And even a quarterback going in to say, okay, I actually want to change this play, that play has to be a part of the playbook, which is a part of what the offensive coordinator is doing. So I don't think that that's actually a knock. I think some people use that as a knock to their offensive coordinators. But play calling is going to be kind of one of those things that's going to be under a microscope very early. Will there be more aggressiveness for this New Orleans Saints team in its play calling? Will there be more screen passes, more RPOs with Taysom Hill? How will Taysom Hill be utilized? How will players be utilized in terms of their usage on the field, like when they are on the field versus when they aren't on the field? These are all things that we don't know until we get into the season with this team and get an opportunity to really see the way that they orchestrate themselves in between. Here's how I think the New Orleans Saints curb any of the offensive play calling unknownness or concern. And it's to have a freaking identity. I think that's number one on the list. If you have an identity that says, this is what we do as an offense, you have a bit of a guiding compass, if you will, in terms of how it is that you want to attack certain game situations. One of the things that would always kind of like pique my interest over the course of the past couple of years is that the Saints would talk about this whole, Taysom Hill disappearing acts and stuff like that, to where like he was a huge part of the game plan, then he would be gone for a couple of days or a couple games, or he was gone for an entire half, like the Cleveland game, just not used at all the first half in a game that was like built for Taysom Hill, right? All you could do was run the football and all these other things. And I would have accepted if the Saints would have gone up and said, you know what, we wanted to wear the defense down a bit, then get into the second half and then start running it and utilizing Taysom Hill a little bit more. Cool. That's actually something that you probably would have turned around and gone, okay, cool. That there was a reason. Does it make sense? Up to you. But there was a reason. The one that would always kind of pique my ears and pique my interest was always when the thing was, well, the game situation didn't allow for Taysom Hill to be utilized, when I think everyone agreed that Taysom Hill should be a part of every game situation. Literally, if there's any player out there that should be a part of any game situation, it's the guy that can do anything, right? So it was like those types of things where you kind of went, okay, well, that's where you needed an identity to say, that's a part of the DNA of our team. You utilize that. That is a weapon for your team and all these other things. So I think that developing the identity early, which is one of the reasons why I love seeing the New Orleans Saints utilizing play action and motion and all these other pieces early on. Rookie mini camps, they were running motion. OTAs, mandatory mini camps, motion, play action, all of it, right? So I think that that's one of those things where you can kind of see, okay, great, they're instilling this as a part of their DNA. They're not waiting for particular game situations, and obviously game situations will dictate things. Don't get me wrong. But there are certain things that should be static across your game situations, especially game situations that are win and lose circumstances, right? Like Tampa years ago, when you're running a 2-man route with Taysom Hill and Kirk Merritt, when you have Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed and Alvin Kamara and all these other players that are a part of your roster and should be a part of your identity and DNA. So to me, like, it's that. And we've seen inklings of it already, but the other piece of it's going to be sequencing, understanding play flow. We did enough of this outside zone, so let's run this outside play action, bootleg type situations on the throwbacks and all these other things. And then kind of building off this stuff. This is what Sean Payton used to call building a tendency so that you can then break the tendency. And so there's 2 games we played. There's the long game, which is building tendencies weeks 1 through 9, and then breaking that tendency in week 12 in a tight game situation, or building tendencies quarters 1 through 3, then to break those tendencies in quarter 4 in a game tying or game deciding situation. So I think that becomes a part of it too. So those are two. That's really the big thing, is creating an identity and then building those tendencies so that you can break them, and understanding how to do that via sequencing your offense. So that's what we're looking at there. All right. Tomorrow, Aaron Shots, DVOA, deep dive, looking at where the New Orleans Saints were, where they're headed going into 2024. We appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Pelicans with Jake Madison, Matt Moscona over at Locked On LSU, over at SEC Media Days. Ton of news over there for you. So make sure you go check that out. Appreciate you, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you. Literally, if there's any player out there